Welcome back to the Energeia podcast after a lengthy hiatus while we settle into the new year, and a very happy new year to you all. Today I will be speaking with Russell T. Warne. Russell is an intelligence researcher who serves on the editorial board of the academic journal Intelligence, and who was previously the associate editor for the Journal for the Education of the Gifted and a member of the editorial boards of the Journal of School Psychology, Gifted Child Quarterly, and the Journal of Psychoeducational Assessment. He holds a PhD in educational psychology from Texas A&M University, and between 2011 and 2022, he taught at Utah Valley University, obtaining tenure and the rank of associate professor. Russell has published over 60 scholarly articles in peer-reviewed academic journals and is the author of the acclaimed undergraduate statistics textbook, Statistics for the Social Sciences, a General Linear Model Approach. And more topically, he is also the author of the book In the Know, Debunking 35 Myths About Human Intelligence, which was published by Cambridge University Press in October 2020, and the subject matter of which will form the basis of our discussion today. So Russell, welcome to the Energeia podcast, and thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
It's a real pleasure to have you along. And before we get into the main grist of today's discussion, I wonder if you might just share with our listeners a little bit about your background, academic or otherwise, and how you ended up working in the field of intelligence research.
Yeah. When I was an undergraduate majoring in psychology, I took a class on psychological testing, and I really fell in love with that field. And so I went to graduate school in educational psychology in a program that would allow me to have a substantive focus in education, but also training in test development, test creation, test analysis, etc. And because my program happened to be housed in a college of education, I had to take some education classes. I wasn't thrilled about them, but I didn't hate them either. But one I was required to take was called Giftedness, Intelligence, and Creativity. And the stuff I learned in part of a semester about intelligence just blew my mind. And I'd gotten little pieces earlier, but having about 4 weeks of a class dedicated to it, I just kept learning more and more amazing things. I was like, how did I never hear this as an undergraduate majoring in psychology? And so I fell into the field because of that. And fast forward roughly 15 years, and I've written a book about it, published a lot of articles on it, and now outside of methodology and testing, that's my big passion right there is intelligence research, and I'm glad I stumbled into it.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing the story of your journey with us, giving the potted overview of your journey. I've been eager to have you on this podcast since I read your book In the Know a couple of years ago. And maybe just to set a little bit of personal context for why that is, I'm certainly no expert on intelligence or intelligence research myself, but I've paid enough attention to the public conversation on this subject to observe that it's kind of become one of the most contentious and controversial and inflammatory and kind of just outright radioactive topics to be found anywhere within the social and cognitive sciences, if not academia altogether. I don't think we need to, necessarily relitigate at any length what has happened historically with people like Charles Murray, who famously co-authored the Bell Curve some 3 decades ago, I think, at this point, although perhaps we'll get into that during our discussion. But what has always been so striking for me is just how maligned the field of intelligence research is. The sheer level and intensity of vitriol and opprobrium in that malignment, and just how unfair, inaccurate, or just how outright caricatured so many of the criticisms are. And I've witnessed this, again, as an outsider. I've witnessed this happen before in other contentious fields like evolutionary psychology and cognitive neuroscience, but nothing that comes close to the opposition that intelligence research seems to reliably receive. So before we get into exploring IQ and intelligence itself, could you give me your own view on the reason or reasons why this field continues to represent such a boogeyman in the eyes of its critics and why it continues to receive the volume and the style of criticism that it does.
Yeah, and you summed it up really well, and you brought up a lot of fields that produce similar levels of vitriol. I think the big reason that a lot of people don't like intelligence research is that a lot of the strong empirical findings, some of which I explore in my book, In the Know, are things that people don't want to hear. In the United States, we have this really strong egalitarian undercurrent in our culture. It's woven into the founding of the nation, that all people are created equal. There's this idea that with hard work you can go from rags to riches in America, and the intelligence researchers step in and say, that's not quite true. You don't win a lot of friends when you go to a party. You say, yeah, some people are smarter than others, and there's not a lot we know how to do about that, with a couple minor exceptions we can get into later. And then when you add in the fact that there's a lot of strong genetic research showing that in wealthy countries there's intelligence is highly heritable, and that intelligence is a great predictor of people's economic success as adults, it starts really going against that egalitarian flavor that the US and a lot of other countries have. And if for people whose philosophy or whose politics are dominated by the blank slate, intelligence research seems to consistently produce a lot of inconvenient, unwelcome findings. That being said, there are some smart people who recognize, and I quote and cite them in the book towards the end, who recognize that the findings aren't left wing or right wing. You can take research from intelligence and support a variety of social policies. But if you start off with the assumption that everybody is approximately equally intelligent from birth, and that with the right educational program or the right life experiences, everyone could be an Einstein, you don't like what this field has to say. And I think that's where a lot of the vitriol and the opposition comes from.
All right. Well, let's get into the book and its contents. I mean, for me, the beautiful thing about this book is just how systematic and methodical you were in taking apart like some of the most pervasive critiques and canards about intelligence. I think you did an excellent job of steel manning each opposing position and then just using a careful, measured analysis of the data to pick apart those positions. I mean, at grad school, I was a B minus student in statistics at best. And yet I found your summaries of the key stats that you invoke to support your counterclaims to be super straightforward to follow and digest. And I suspect the majority of lay people, or at least those with a high enough IQ, would feel similarly. Now, we're not going to have time to go through each of the 35 myths that you debunk in the book. So I picked a few of the ones that seemed most notable, or at least most notable to me, or the ones that seemed to be the most contended against, again, from an outsider's perspective. And perhaps we can see where our noses lead us from there. But I'll start off with chapter 1. In the very first chapter, you state, quote, "The idea that intelligence is just a set of arbitrarily chosen tasks that are thrown together on an intelligence test is simply not true." Could you elaborate on what you mean by this, and perhaps also explain why you chose to address this particular faulty claim in the very first chapter?
Yeah, and each chapter opens up. I'm glad you mentioned I steel man the opposing arguments, because each chapter does open up with quotes illustrating these incorrect ideas people have. That chapter opens with a quote from a textbook, a psychology college textbook. And I started with that one because it is one of the most common, and it's the most fundamental. A really common quote we find in psychology, and it comes from, I believe, the 1920s. Edwin Boring says, a famous psychologist at the time, says that intelligence is whatever intelligence tests measure. And it's this horrible circular definition, but it's catchy and people remember it. And so, this idea is, okay, if I put a vocabulary and mathematics questions on my test and you put processing speed and spatial reasoning questions on your test, we both call them IQ. They're not measuring the same thing. And on the surface, it seems correct. And a lot of these myths or these incorrect ideas I address are plausible. Reasonable people have good reasons to believe in them. And if you look at the surface content of different intelligence test items, sometimes test A and test B don't overlap in content at all. And yet the psychologists are still calling them both intelligence. I get why people believe that, but I start with that one because it's so fundamental. And decades ago, long before I was born, psychologists discovered that the appearance of a test item does not always reflect what the test item measures. And that's true not just in intelligence tests, it's true for other types of tests, but it's definitely true on intelligence tests. As long as there is some sort of reasoning, decision making based on rules, as long as there's something like that on the item, it will measure intelligence to some degree. Some items and some formats are better than others. And so it doesn't matter if on my test it's vocabulary math and on yours it's spatial reasoning and processing speed. It's what the tasks require you to do. And if it requires you to reason, to think, to make judgments and decisions, to use algorithms and rules, to deduce, etc., those items will still measure intelligence. And in that chapter, I cite studies where the same sample of people have been given sometimes 2, 3, 4 tests. And the correlations of the scores are so high that it's pretty obvious that the tests do measure intelligence regardless of their surface appearance. And so I wanted to start with that one just to show people it actually doesn't matter what we're using for the tests. We're still measuring something inside people's heads that's giving them the ability to solve problems and answer questions.
Right, and that's ultimately what counts. All right. Well, in chapter 2 of the book, just progressing along at a steady speed for now, you say, quote, anyone who attacks intelligence research by arguing that IQ isn't everything is attacking a straw man. Modern viewpoints take into account the complexity of human cognition while still finding a place for G, end quote, with G meaning general intelligence. Is it true to say both that we can summarize intelligence using just one score and that score doesn't represent everything about an individual's cognition? And if so, why do so many critics of intelligence research seem to find these ideas so disagreeable or irreconcilable?
I think you summed up really well. Yes, there's this place for the general reasoning, but there's also places for other abilities that are more specific. I'll admit to you right now, my spatial reasoning is in the toilet. I've never had it formally measured exactly, but it's definitely below the average American man's spatial reasoning. I'm probably somewhere in like the 15th percentile. But my verbal reasoning is good enough to write a book, I guess. And so I think people, and again, this is some of that egalitarian culture that we especially have in the US, but is also found in other Western nations. People don't like the idea that they can be summed up with one number. And so with a lot of focus on IQ, and there is a lot of focus on IQ in the field, it can feel very dehumanizing at times. It can feel very like we're stripping out a lot of the richness of how people answer questions. We ignore their culture, etc. And so I get why people feel that way, but I don't know a single colleague of mine who thinks that IQ is the only number we need to know about anyone. It's an important one, and the more general the life outcome, the more important IQ tends to be. But for specific life outcomes or for specific predictions, it's not very good. IQ measures general intelligence, so it's really good at general predictions. So it's really good at predicting whether a 10-year-old will one day get a college degree. It's really bad at predicting that 10-year-old's grade in intro to English their freshman year of college 8-10 years down the road. And so I actually quote the late Julian Stanley, a psychologist, educational psychologist like me, who said IQ tells us a lot generally, but not very much specifically. And it's when you start looking for those specific outcomes that you do need a verbal reasoning score or spatial reasoning. So yeah, you know, I don't know if I had my IQ measured in childhood, it probably would have predicted I would have graduated from college, but it wouldn't have told you about how bad I am at assembling furniture from IKEA.
Right.
That's
And would
too
have
simple.
told you anything about specific classes or how well you would have done in specific subjects or anything like that. Right. And I think that's kind of a nice segue actually to the next chapters that I want to address. So collectively, chapter 5 and later in chapter 26 on this theme of IQ not being everything. In these chapters, you explore the notion of there being multiple intelligences, something that's usually originally attributed to the work of Howard Gardner. I teach at a business school, at a business school at a university here in Vietnam, and terms like emotional intelligence and cultural intelligence are absolute currency in my circles. And I actually have to teach that emotional intelligence is a real thing supported by the data, and that it has very, very strong links to your personal and professional success and aspirations and so forth. And I mean, I've read some fairly persuasive arguments and some fairly persuasive scholarly work to support the existence of something like EI or EQ, and then some equally compelling counter arguments that something like EI isn't actually an intelligence at all, or an intelligence per se, or that it can be subsumed within general intelligence. So I think I'm kind of a multiple intelligences agnostic at this point. I'm not sure. I sometimes waver on one side of the fence or another, depending on what mood you find me in. But for you personally, is there any substance to the claim that we each have qualities like emotional intelligence or other kinds of intelligence? Or is this just a straight up fallacy? Or is it somewhere in between?
Yeah, I'll start with emotional intelligence and then I'll move on to the Howard Gardner theory of multiple intelligences. With emotional intelligence, I am cautiously skeptical about it. I don't think the data are strong enough to say, oh, that definitely doesn't exist. It's made up. I also don't think the data are strong enough to say it's definitely a real separate ability. A lot of emotional intelligence does seem to correlate really strongly with certain personality traits like agreeableness and negatively correlate with neuroticism. And there also does seem to be these tests of emotional intelligence seem to tap into a cognitive reasoning about social situations. Your colleague comes into the break room, you can tell she's been crying, what should you do? And and being able to reason through that. So I do think there's a cognitive component to it, but I'm not sure it's entirely cognitive. I think there might be personality components to it, probably some affective components to it. And so I'm not even sure emotional intelligence is one thing. That one might really be a collection of different things, the way that IQ isn't, general intelligence isn't. And so I'm like you, I'm a little bit on the fence, but I'm more on the skeptical side. What I really wish had not happened in the emotional intelligence world is almost 30 years ago, in 1995, Daniel Goleman published a book called Emotional Intelligence. And because he was a New York Times writer, it got a lot of attention. And it said, putting the cart before the horse, the data were not there at the time. Wow, this is real. This is more important for business than anything else. This is more important for your personal life than anything else. You don't need to know someone's SAT score. You just need to know their EQ. The data definitely weren't there in 1995, and I think that was irresponsible for him to publish that at the time. But he's a journalist, not a scientist. What can I do? Fast forward almost 30 years, there are more data supporting some of the ideas behind emotional intelligence than there were in the 90s. The the strongest proponents of EQ in psychology are much more cautious than Daniel Goleman was in the 90s. And they're not likely to say, oh, emotional intelligence is the most important thing in the workplace. They're more likely to say it's a valued trait among many for certain jobs like managers and customer service, etc., which I can respect. And so, yeah, the wild claims from 28 years ago, I can't get behind those, but I'm cautious and open to some of the more circumscribed claims of today's proponents. As far as Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences, that's different. He originally proposed, I believe it was seven intelligences, and Gardner is very adamant. These are independent intelligences. They do not correlate with one another. There is no general ability that all reasoning items tap into. It's wildly popular in education. In schools of education, I did a study on their on catalogs of schools of education in the United States. Over a third of them teach courses on Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. Teachers love it. There is more evidence for the existence of elves than there is for the existence of multiple intelligence theory. No matter what people do, all these cognitive tasks always correlate with one another. Even studies from multiple intelligence proponents produce a G general factor. And I think it's really telling that Gardner published this book. It has its 40th anniversary this year. He published his theory in his book this year. And he's never engaged in a research program to gather data to support his theory. And if you can't even be bothered to do that for 40 years, I'm not going to be bothered to engage with your theory much.
Yeah, and fair enough. I just want to linger on EI for a little while because I went to grad school at Case Western Reserve in Cleveland, Ohio, and so a couple of the professors there had actually published with Goldman. Had actually, a couple of their major trade books were co-authored with Goldman, and so when I did my PhD in organizational behavior. We were basically told that EI is everything, more or less. Somewhat overstating the claim here, but more or less we were told that, especially in the world of business, basically all of your professional success and vocational performance can be attributed to EI and very, very little to IQ. Again, somewhat overstating the claim here, but I've read I think it was John Antonakis at the University of Lausanne. He did a really nice paper one time that basically said that if you put IQ and, I think it was conscientiousness actually, not agreeableness, if you put IQ and conscientiousness together, that explains everything that EI claims to explain. So, yeah, look, I mean, I'm in a difficult position because, I would love to be able to deliver to my students an empirically rigorous and robust account of this thing we call emotional intelligence, because I feel like there's no unringing that bell as far as the terminology is concerned, right? That the horse has already bolted the gate. It's one of those terms that we kind of we're stuck with now. It's almost like we have to sort of, at best we can perhaps reconceptualize it, but I don't think we're going to rename it or anything like that, or rebrand it. But I would like to think that, someday I might be able to get up in front of my students and be able to say with a straight face, not thinking in the back of my mind, I'm not giving them the whole picture here. I'd like to be able to say to them with a straight face, EI really is the biggest predictor of leadership, as I've been telling you these last few years, and we actually have the data to support it. But I don't know, maybe that's just wish thinking on my part.
Yeah, and I will say, to the credit of the EI scholars and the EI crowd, the quality of their research has been increasing consistently over the past 25 years. I will give that to them, and if I had written my book 15 years ago, I would have been much more dismissive. But yeah, personality traits plus general reasoning ability explain most of of what there is in emotional intelligence. I'm in general skeptical of claims of discovering new psychological constructs and traits anyway. Psychology's been a science now for almost 150 years, since the 1870s. And so the idea that someone in the 90s or the 21st century can say, aha, I discovered a trait that 5 or 6 generations of psychologists before me never, ever, ever noticed. I'm really skeptical about that. Really? You did? and even before that, when psychology was a branch of philosophy for thousands of years, really no one back to the ancient Greeks noticed what you discovered with your brilliance, and I'm skeptical in general of new constructs. Almost always someone's discovered it before. Usually many decades
Yeah.
before anyone today was born.
Yeah. No. Heretofore, no one happened upon this thing that just, apparently is so crucial for success in life and work. We've only just happened upon it recently. Yeah, it doesn't, on the face of it, it doesn't seem that likely. All right, well, we'll move past EI onto Chapter 9. So in Chapter 9, you explore the idea that IQ tests themselves, the claim that IQ tests themselves aren't sufficiently rigorous enough to be precise measures of intelligence. How would you respond to the idea that intelligence tests simply don't have enough statistical reliability to be of any use or utility?
I would first say, what is the use you want them for? And is what you're asking them to do realistic? Again, they're really good at global general predictions. They're really bad at specific ones. I even published an article about 3 years ago using data from a famous study by Lewis Terman. He found over 1,500 high IQ children in the 1920s, and they were followed until 1999 for over 70 years. And he missed 2 children who would later grow up and win Nobel Prizes in physics. And all 1,500 of the kids he found, none of them won a Nobel. Some of them did other amazing things, but never a Nobel. And so some people say, aha, this shows that IQ tests are flawed. He missed Nobelists. He found people who did squat with their life. Some of them did very little. Some of them did do amazing things. And so I say, look, are you trying to ask too much of a test? There's no way we can predict from childhood who's going to win a Nobel. That's just not possible. Maybe you can predict it in graduate school for bright people. Even then, it's a little shaky, and your predictions aren't going to be very good. So first, I would say, well, what use are you talking about? Is it a use that is not realistic to expect of any predictor? Then I don't think you should beat up intelligence tests about that. But for the sort of predictions and the sort of correlations we do use the test for, I think you can legitimately investigate the question of how reliable are these tests, how good are decisions based on them. And to me, the standard should not be perfection. There's no medical test that is 100% accurate, for example. Thousands of women every year have false positives with mammograms, and thousands have false negatives with mammograms. The same thing happens with any test. And so, to me, the standard is, how do intelligence tests perform compared to other predictors? And college admissions is the perfect example of that, at least in the United States. The SAT and the ACT, they're decent predictors of college performance, but they're not perfect. It's not hard to find a kid who bombed the SAT and who later goes on to get a master's or a doctorate and do very well in college. The reverse is true. It's not hard to find people who do well on the test and then who drop out after a couple of years. So I don't think perfection's a good standard. I think the standard should be, how well do these tests compare to other predictors? And for college admissions, the best other predictor is high school grades. And SAT, ACT, and high school grades have about the same level of accuracy and prediction. It's about a tie. In some schools, one outperforms the other, but on average, it's about a tie. And you get even better predictions by combining both sources of data. And so, I look at it and I say, okay, yes, I see why the critics are skeptical because the tests aren't perfect, but perfection's not the right standard to hold them to. I don't live in a perfect world. I live in the real world. And if I'm not going to make college admissions decisions using a test, I still have to make that decision. Is the alternative any better than intelligence tests? And usually, often, for realistic predictions, the answer is no. Or if there is a predictor that's as good or better, intelligence usually comes in at, second or third place, which I think is pretty good.
It is. And there is kind of a weird standard. It just made me think that it often seems like psychometricians are expected to be soothsayers about individual people's lives and their life outcomes and things like that. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I mean, among all the tests that we have, the widely used and subscribed to tests that we have available to us in psychology, IQ is not perfect, as you say, but, the way that it's, the stats shake out on it, it certainly looks pretty impressive compared to what I've read about something like emotional intelligence, where, some of the tests have some, I mean, forget about what you said earlier about Goldman, like, before any of the data actually came in, even when you mentioned the data's improved and everything like that over the years, but I mean, some of the tests of EI have not found it to be anything but shaky at best, certainly shaky compared to something like IQ. And so I just feel like there's a double standard here at play that IQ, I think you might have actually mentioned this towards the end of the book, that something like IQ needs to be held, or it's perceived to need to be held to a higher standard than other tests because of its, I think you said it in reference to sort of like the kind of inflammatory nature of the subject matter that it is trying to test. But I think it's being held to a double standard all round anyway. It feels like its most vitriolic critics really are expecting some standard of psychometric robustness that they would never expect of other psychological tests that are out there that are popular.
Oh, I agree. And a good example comparison is personality tests. And I respect personality psychology a lot. It's a very closely allied field. They use a lot of the same methodologies that we use in intelligence research. We go to the same conferences. A good, you're in IO psych, you're in organizational behavior business. A good correlation between a personality test score and job performance is 0.3. People in personality psych are dancing in the streets if they get a 0.3 correlation between job performance and an intelligence test score. Usually the correlations are between 0 and 0.15, 0 and 0.2. In intelligence research, 0.3 is the worst you can find. There are some jobs where IQ correlates 0.5, 0.6, and then after you get rid of restriction of range, it's actually like 0.7 or 0.8 sometimes. And yet no one is criticizing the personality tests for being bad at predicting who's going to be a good salesman. They do that for IQ. And I think it's just because, there is a double standard, and it's just how it is. And the best I can do is say, well, let's look at the data. Yeah.
Yeah, look, and this is a perfect layup to take us into chapter 26, which is entitled Intelligence is Not Important in the Workplace. So, as an organizational psychologist, this one is so obviously, laughably untrue that it almost doesn't deserve the time of day. Like, particularly when it comes to the highest echelons of management within professional organizations and, other such structured corporate entities. As I tell my students, and, not intending to be mean-spirited about it, dumb people simply don't make good leaders. It's that simple. You are not going to find the head of a very, very successful, enterprising company who has subnormal intelligence, right? I think that the data on this is fairly clear. And so, why do some people claim that intelligence isn't relevant or important to professional performance or success? And how would you respond to such claims?
I'm not a mind reader, so I don't want to say, oh, here's why people think that. I will say, psychology is not good at publicizing the research on intelligence. So I think that some people just genuinely don't know. And I don't criticize anyone for not being an expert in my field. It took years for me to become an expert. Most people don't have that sort of time. So I cut people some slack. That being said, you're right. People who are below average in intelligence don't make very good leaders. And not only that, they don't make very good decisions. And that's where you get killed in business. Because running a company is about making dozens of decisions every day. Some of them matter a lot, some of them don't. But it's a constant exercise in judgment and decision making, usually based on incomplete data that you have to extrapolate from on the fly. I can't imagine how many companies wish that they knew exactly what their competitors were planning on releasing next year in their product line. But you don't know that. You might get hints from what they're spending on for R&D. You might get hints from their calls to investors. And so you have to make decisions about what your company's going to do based on that incomplete information. Smarter people are better at that. And so, yeah, to me, it is self-evident. I think another reason why is because we've all had a dumb boss. And we've all had people who do rise to a certain level and do quite well for themselves in their position. And so if you've had 2 or 3 of those in your career, you might start thinking, you know what? Maybe managers don't have to be very smart. But that's why it's always dangerous to extrapolate from individual experience to a generalized conclusion. And I do believe that, companies aren't perfect in selecting who to hire or fire and who to promote, but companies that make smarter decisions and have smarter people in decision-making positions will, in general, thrive in the long run. And companies that don't are going to make a lot more mistakes. How do I know that without being a manager ever in a private corporation? Because less intelligent people also make worse decisions in their personal lives. They're more likely to smoke. They're more likely to drive drunk. They're more likely to engage in risky sexual behavior. They're less likely to invest a portion of their income into retirement. So, of course, those same people aren't going to be very good at making decisions for a company.
Yeah, no, I mean it seems so. Like I said, it almost doesn't bear mentioning, but it does bear mentioning because there's enough people that are apparently under the spell otherwise. But I mean like put it this way, I've come across in my work as a coach, I've come across people who found themselves in positions of leadership who had both low IQ and low EI. And one reason that they get into those positions, nepotism.
Oh, yeah.
Typically it's a family business that's been handed down to them. They're the scion of some family who's been just dubbed the heir apparent. And for all their lack of smarts and for all their lack of emotional smarts, daddy and mummy have decided, well, you're going to take the reins. But that's a very, very separate discussion. So we'll move on now to, well, actually, just maybe a slightly related segue here, but moving back earlier in one's life before they arrive in the professional sphere where they have to make these potentially consequential decisions. The title of the myth you explore in chapter 18 is Every Child is Gifted. Now, this sounds nice, right? I mean, who could possibly argue with that? So, Russell, is every child gifted? And if not, why not?
The answer is no. And why? Because if
the answer is no.
Gifted, yeah. If every child were gifted, then gifted wouldn't mean anything. It would lose any sort of exceptionality. And it does sound nice, You can buy mugs and throw pillows and posters that say every child is gifted on them, which goes to show you you will never go bankrupt selling people something that they want to hear and that they want to believe. So tell that to your business students. There's a reason why my book hasn't been on the New York Times bestseller list, but Daniel Goleman's has been. Again, a lot of these incorrect ideas are things that people want to believe, especially if you're a very egalitarian person. And I have egalitarian sympathies. I get it. And so, no, not every child is gifted. And no matter how you define giftedness, and there are a variety of definitions, and that field hasn't been able to find one that has broad consensus. Whether you see IQ as being a measure of giftedness, or whether you think that school performance matters, or leadership, or other things, our artistic talents like music and painting, etc. The reality is that some people are better at these things than others. And you do have to be denying reality to not recognize that. And for cognitive forms of giftedness based on school performance or specific cognitive abilities or based on intelligence, they're all going to correlate with IQ to some degree. And we know that intelligence is partially influenced by genetics, and that with current technology, there's no way to change that after conception. And so, not every child is gifted because children vary genetically, and one of those consequences of that genetic variation is variations in how well they perform in school, or variations in intelligence. And so, no, not every child is gifted. And that one bugs me a lot because I've done a lot of research in gifted education. But people will believe it because it makes them feel good. And yeah, like I said, I don't win a lot of friends by going to parties and saying things like, no, not every kid's gifted.
No, I can imagine. Well, you're more than welcome at my party. You'd be in very, very, very convivial company at my party. But I mean, I share the not that I share it. I can get, to a point you made earlier. I can kind of get people's concerns and their reservations. Again, that egalitarian, trying to be as humane as possible about this. No one would dispute that, right? But I mean, the fact is, I know nothing about genetics and gene research, although I'm going to segue onto a question about that in just a moment. But it just feels like one of these things where if we in the West, in the so-called enlightened West, continue to say things like every child is gifted, China in the background are going to be recognizing that no, they ain't. And as I mean, I don't want to get us into the realms of fantasy and speculation about where the technology might lead. But when the technology, with respect to how we can possibly edit genes that contribute towards things like intelligence and stuff, are concerned, if we don't avail ourselves of that technology in the West, China is. And who knows what kind of, call it an arms race towards high levels of giftedness. Who knows what that could set off? So, this is all very speculative right now, but it just feels like one of these things where we're making a rod for our own backs in the West by continuing to sort of repeat and regurgitate this idea that simply is not backed up by the facts. No matter how, morally sound our ethical intuitions might be about this, the data lie where the data lie.
Yeah, and Mother Nature doesn't care what our egalitarian beliefs say. Mother Nature doesn't care about what we want to be true. I used to tell my students that I called it the cold, uncaring universe assumption, that reality's out there, it exists, it is what it is, and it doesn't care what we want reality to look like. It's the cold, uncaring universe assumption of science. Yeah, there are various consequences to these incorrect beliefs. The every child is gifted one is, oh, that bugs me a lot. Drives me crazy. I've heard it a lot. That was probably the easiest chapter of the book to write. That being said, I don't see it as the most harmful myth that the book addresses. And there's two reasons why. Number one is that in the US and in other wealthy countries, we have enough funds to educate everybody. We are prosperous enough for that. I think having the idea that every child is gifted is much more detrimental to Nigeria, for example, that might not have as much money to educate everyone. And so, to get the most bang for their education buck, they should concentrate on the nation's best and brightest. And so, in the United States, I don't think that the consequences are as bad for that reason. And also because most gifted programs are actually not terribly effective. Most of them don't actually show that the kids enrolled in them have learned more by the end of the school year or the end of the program. Uh, and so, oh, you think that every child's gifted, so you're going to give the gifted program to everyone? Fine, you're giving them, a program that's no more or less effective than they would have had anyway. So, I don't see a lot of harm from it. But that being said, for these kids and their families, there are some educational adjustments that could be made that often aren't. And they shouldn't have to wait till advanced classes become available in middle or high school or college to have their educational needs met. And I discussed that in the book.
Right. Well, let's maybe keep with the general thread and theme of genes here. So in chapters 11 through 17, you discuss the individual and environmental variables which influence intelligence. I think this could really be the basis of a whole standalone podcast. So we're probably not going to cover everything in major depth or detail here, but in as summary a manner as you possibly can, could you give us the lowdown on where the stats typically shake out with respect to how much of intelligence is influenced by biological factors on the one hand and environmental on the other, and whether one's intelligence level is innate, modifiable, or some combination thereof?
Yeah. Well, it does take both environment and genes to make someone smart. You can have the best genetic makeup ever in any human being, but if I lock you in a closet for your entire childhood and I never send you to school or teach you to read, then you are not going to be very smart. You are going to score in the basement of these intelligence tests. Conversely, if you have the worst genes possible, but I give you the best environment that any human being has ever known, we're going to eventually hit a limit where your genes will not allow you to advance any further. So you have to have the genes, you have to have the environment. This is a really tough subject to study in humans for a variety of reasons, one of the most important of which is ethics. It's not ethical to do the sort of studies that we can do on laboratory animals in humans. And even if we could, we would have to wait 18 years for that person to grow to adulthood to get our results. And the sample sizes you need, this is just not feasible. So we have to let Mother Nature do the experiments for us by having people who are genetically related to varying degrees and who share environments to varying degrees. And we can extrapolate and do some statistics that are too complex for our discussion or for the book. And we can extrapolate that to identify how important genes are compared to environment or vice versa. The clearest example, though it's one of the hardest to find, is identical twins reared in different homes. After they're born, their environments don't have anything in common, but they have the exact same genes. So any differences between them must be environmental. All similarities must be genetic, with the exception of the environment they shared in the womb. But that's another story. Usually we can't do that. Adoption agencies don't like splitting up siblings, especially twins, and most parents who can adopt are more than happy to adopt twins. So that's very rare today, but there are some older studies that do that. But we still know that full siblings are 50% genetically identical. We know that parents and children are also 50% genetically identical, and that grandparents and their grandchildren share 25% of their genes. Same with your blood aunts and uncles share 25% of your genes with you, etc. If people are adopted or raised together, we can extrapolate from that, blah, blah, blah. A lot of these studies, almost always, they occur in wealthy nations, usually Western nations. And so we have a really good idea that if you grow up in a home that's stable and wealthy enough that the parents could adopt if they wanted to, in a Western prosperous nation, then generally genes are more important than environment for determining why some people are smarter than others. Outside of that, for that bottom about 30 to 40% of homes within those nations, and for most developing nations, we have little or no research. And so, outside of that, it's much more of an open question of whether the environment or genes matter. Before the environments we have studied, genes seem to be overwhelmingly important. We're getting better at that research, especially that bottom 30 or 40% of homes in Western nations. We're learning more about it. And we've even seen some studies on this topic from sub-Saharan Africa. So the data are coming, but for the sort of environment that my children are growing up in, whether I give them music lessons or not, whether they get enrolled in the local district gifted program or not, those typical differences in environment for the sort of home my kids are growing up in, those don't seem to matter much for IQ. Genes matter far more. But outside of that range, especially in developing nations, all bets are off. Sometimes environment does matter much more. So that's a long-winded answer to what sounds like a simple question on the surface.
Well, actually, I was just about to say, for anyone who thought that was the most inflammatory part of our discussion so far, I need to move now onto the final couple of questions for you, Russell. The part of the book that is going to seem the most controversial to many people, I think, is chapters 27 through 30, where you discuss demographic differences in IQ scores. So, I mean, this one is just, it's a reliably radioactive topic. It has been since at least the bell curve, and probably years before that. I mean, I personally always thought the idea that there would be population level average differences between groups in intelligence, I thought that would actually be a fairly banal and kind of trite statement about statistics. And yet this seems to be the talking point that fairly reliably invokes totally unfair and unjustifiable, and in some cases, quite personally damaging and career damaging charges of sexism and racism and so forth. I know people like, Richard Heyer, who I always just find a remarkably clear and thoughtful and lucid guy who just is so engaged with the data and with his own research. Someone like him, and he by no means is he the only example, but he's had to seemingly counter so many smear attacks and things like that in his career. So in any case, in as forthright a manner as you'd care to, could you tell us whether there are differences in intelligence between men and women, different ethnicities, different nationalities, etc.? And if so, what the primary causes of these differences are?
Okay. Let me start from least controversial to most controversial for those. Let's start with sex differences. I do have some colleagues who believe that there is an average sex difference between males and females in general intelligence. I don't think there is. I am open to changing my mind if the data come out, but for the most representative samples of adults, I'm not terribly convinced that there are differences in average ability across males and females. Where we do see a difference across sexes is in their variability. Males seem to be more spread out in their scores. There's a surplus of males at the very lowest end of intelligence and at the very highest end. And there's a surplus of females in between. Now, if you're just going about your daily business in the general population in typical environments, you're not going to notice this. But if you deal with people in the bottom 5, 10, 15% of IQ and the top 5 to 15% of IQ, you are going to notice this. This is a large enough difference that you notice. And I give some statistics in the book about how in the United States, over 60% of children in special education programs are male. The more severe an intellectual disability is, the more of a percentage of males, of a percentage of people who have it who are males. And then on the extreme end, on the other side, on the game show Jeopardy, men win almost 70% of games in it on this quiz show. And similar things are apparent in UK, British quiz shows, and other things. So you notice when you look at the extremes. And so I'm not terribly surprised when we find a very high IQ field of study, like physics or advanced microbiology, where it's mostly men. I'm not saying that that's good or that's bad, but it doesn't surprise me, because at those very highest levels of IQ that people need to enter and to succeed in those fields, it's predominantly male. And I don't think that sexism can sufficiently explain the gender imbalance. Otherwise, you then have to explain why sexism also causes more males to end up in special education. You can't have it both ways. Sexism can't boost some men and also, drop other men down the social scale at the same time. You can't have it both ways. So that's the least controversial.
Sorry, just to interject there, just one thing I can't help but bring this up since you mentioned Jeopardy. I just think, and I know you can't extrapolate much of anything from one person's case, but it was a pretty notable case that the most successful woman to appear on Jeopardy was Amy Schneider. And I loved following her run. She was great. She was fantastic. But Amy Schneider was a trans woman, biologically male, or, assigned male at birth, as some people would like to say. And so, I'm just saying, not for nothing, ...
Oh, yeah. Yep, and you bet that I noticed that when that contestant was making headlines. Yeah, definitely. And you see another one, for example, is chess. In the top 1,000 chess players, something like 15 or 12 of them are it can't be that low, but about 40 or 50 are female. And and you can say that culture can influence some of these gender imbalances. Having a competition to show off your smarts is a very male thing. Chess, the idea of being obsessive about a game and increasing your rating tends to be more male. And it is true that males tend to have fewer but more passionate interests. So if you're female and you like chess, but you also like cooking and visiting your friends and swimming, then you're going to spend your time across 4 different hobbies. But if you're male and chess is your only thing, you're going to devote 4 more times of more effort and time and thought to it. So of course you're going to do better. So I'm not going to say it's solely due to IQ, but those gender imbalances at the extreme, to me, are not terribly surprising. And males are more variable, not just in intelligence. They're more variable in a lot of traits: height, weight, personality traits. We get more males engaging in, more males are serial killers, but also more males run charities. We see it in a lot of things, and we see it across species too. especially
Yeah.
in mammals. Males tend to be more variable. Charles Darwin noticed that. So finishing up there, moving on to international differences. You're living in Vietnam, which is an emerging economy, but you've also lived in the U.S. and I assume some other countries based on your accent. You know that there are some pretty stark differences between economic and health and living conditions across nations. I've lived overseas too. I've seen it firsthand. To think that a country that can't afford to educate every child, that can't even afford to give everyone basic health care to treat parasites and infections, like dysentery, waterborne illnesses, cholera. To think that those countries are going to be just as good at developing people's mental abilities as the UK or Germany or Canada or the US are, to me, I think is living in a fantasy world. Unless you think that environment doesn't matter, we should expect to see some IQ differences across countries. And every single one of my colleagues thinks that as living conditions improve, especially in sub-Saharan Africa and Southern Asia, they do expect IQ differences between the developed world and less developed nations to narrow because the environment matters. What is more of an open question is if every country were as prosperous as Western Europe, would those IQ gaps close completely? And I have some colleagues who are very pessimistic about that. I have other colleagues who are more optimistic. I'm not sure we know entirely, but why not let the rest of the world develop and let's find out? I can't think of a good reason to withhold economic prosperity from people and all over the world. But yes, we do see IQ differences. I just published an article a couple months ago saying that those IQ differences don't always reflect differences in intelligence. A lot of the tests we use to measure international differences don't function the same way for Western nations as they do in sub-Saharan Africa or Southern Asia. And that makes it so you can't draw the conclusion that that the test measures the same ability in both countries. So, yes, we have IQ differences. Are they intelligence differences? Not necessarily. And I'm working on some research to explore that. Come back to me in about 2 or 3 years and I'll have some answers for you. And so yeah, there are IQ differences. I think it would be shocking if there weren't, given how different living conditions are all over the world. But those don't necessarily reflect intelligence differences.
Okay, and
Let's move on to the most
just
controversial. Do you want to move on to the most controversial? Are we going there?
Yeah, I think we probably should. Since we've gone that far, we may as well just keep on digging our graves here.
In for a penny, in for a pound, right?
Absolutely, sir. Absolutely.
I believe that the most controversial topic in all the social sciences is race differences in intelligence. And the race difference that has been studied the most is African Americans and white Americans. There are other countries that have done some of this research. There are other groups within the United States that we've done some of this research, but that's a group comparison where we have data going back over 100 years. And just like we find with international differences, there is an IQ difference. And I respect people who say, okay, well, that IQ difference may not reflect intelligence differences. I respect that. I don't think it's correct, though, as long as the examinees are tested in their native language for a test designed for their country. And so I don't put stock into comparisons of immigrants in the United States compared to native-born English speakers like me in the United States. I don't put stock into that. I don't put stock into tests where people don't speak the language as their first language. One of my best friends is from Colombia originally, and for a job he applied to, he was given a test in English, an intelligence test in English, and I was furious that they did that. It definitely underestimated his IQ. But if you're talking only about people tested in their native language on a test designed for their country, then yeah, these IQ differences do reflect intelligence differences. And then the question becomes why? And there have been people who have lost their jobs. You mentioned Rich Heyer, who has been grossly unfairly maligned and defamed. I very much respect Rich. He's more cautious about these questions than I am, and even his level of caution sometimes gets you impugned as a racist and an evil person. And he's never once deserved that in his long, illustrious career. You've had people threatened for investigating this topic. Bomb threats to their physical safety. And it's a legitimate scientific empirical question. And the great James Flynn, who passed away a little over a year ago, who tooth and nail fought the idea that IQ differences across races could be non-environmental. He, for over 40 years, said, this is a legitimate question to research. People should be allowed to ask it and to research it without interference, and this research should be funded. And, even though I disagreed with Jim on a lot of topics, man, I respect the hell out of him. And when he died, that was a major blow because he was fair. In the book, when I say, okay, why are these race differences in intelligence there? I say that I believe that the evidence shows that the genetic component is not zero, but we don't know what the genetic component is. The methodology has been out there for decades that we could have answered this question by now, but opposition to the research has been so strong that either people would rather research something else, or you can't ever get funding, or they don't like the idea of their mail having to be screened by the bomb squad before they open it, that they decide not to research it. And I can't blame people for that. Heaven knows I haven't done much research in it either. But I think that the data are strong if we can say, okay, these race differences have a non-zero genetic component, but we don't know how strong it is. My position is that for all we know, the genetic component's really trivial. Maybe it's 3%, 5%, 10%. In which case, who the hell cares? Fine, let's answer the question, move on with our lives. If it's more, if it's 20, 50, 60, 80%, I don't know, then it's better to know and then create social policies to address that. And say, okay, now we know that there's this issue here. How do we mitigate that to create a society that looks more like the society we want, instead of putting our head in the sand? And so, yeah, in the book I say there is a genetic component. How strong, we don't know. But it's worth finding out so we can deal with this question once and for all and move on as a society.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think that this actually tees us up really nicely, these sort of like macro level considerations of these issues. So just last question from me, Russell, and thank you for being so generous with your time already. The final section of the book explores societal and ethical issues in intelligence research. And I'm kind of collapsing a series of different considerations and different chapters in the book into one kind of sort of somewhat long-winded composite question here. But what do you make of the charge that intelligence research is just so laden with damaging historical baggage, so like tangled up in associations with stuff, pseudoscience like eugenics and things like that, and so reliably inflammatory and radioactive that the whole field must be contributing to negative social outcomes like inequality and social injustice and so forth?
No, it's a very legitimate question. And you're right, there are multiple chapters that explore this from different perspectives. Let's first start with the historic period. Yeah, a lot of early pioneers in this field were eugenicists. So were a lot of people over 100 years ago in Western and non-Western nations, by the way. There were eugenics movements in Latin America, in East Asia. There was a native eugenics movement in India. It wasn't just a thing in the U.S. and Europe, by the way. But a lot of the early pioneers in this field were eugenicists, and it's not hard to dig up some ugly, horrendously disgusting quotes from some of these people. I don't think we should hide that history. I'm not a fan of sweeping ugly history under the rug, and so I lay it all out there in a chapter of the book. But I say in the book that just because one idea ended up being pseudoscience or ended up being discredited, and there's various forms of eugenics that were, doesn't mean that every idea that a person subscribed to was also similarly discredited. And I say saints can be factually wrong, sinners can be right sometimes. And the wonderful thing about ideas is that they're a buffet. Ideas aren't bound together. And you don't have to, just because you subscribe to one theory from a past thinker doesn't mean you have to agree with everything they ever said. You're allowed to pick and choose different ideas. And so, yeah, we should dispose of incorrect theories, discriminatory practices and policies, and pick up the empirically supported ideas that great science can be built on. And I lay it all out there, warts and all, in chapter 32 of the book. As for today, I said this at the beginning of our conversation, I think intelligence research can be used to support a wide variety of social policies. And I even engage in a hypothetical argument about immigration that is based on intelligence research that supports more left-wing ideas of immigration, and then the same research could support more right-wing ideas. I find that most research is either apolitical. A lot of neuroscience research, for example, doesn't have any important political connotations, or you can use the same data to support a variety of policies. And so, no, I don't think that intelligence research inherently supports inequality, income inequality or societal inequality. I also don't think it's inherently egalitarian either. I think you can use the research to support a wide variety of views, and human beings are very creative in getting the facts to be twisted into a way that support their wants anyway. And so, no, I don't find the field particularly leaning one way or another. Although, if you have certain policies that you support because of the blank slate, you might find intelligence research problematic, but often you can find intelligence research that supports those policies anyway. Funny.
Right, yeah. And I mean, people are going to window dress the data for their own self-interested political motivations and purposes anyway. I don't think that's going to be something that we're going to be able to overcome anytime soon, unfortunately, and regrettably. But Russell, this conversation really has been an additional layer of enlightenment on top of that, which I personally benefited from in reading your book. I think there's a huge number of IQ skeptics and critics out there who would be, really well served by reading your book and getting all their facts straight, and at least trying to put the data before their preconceptions or their ideology or their sort of like visceral, reflexive, again, the that well-intentioned egalitarianism, which sometimes goes off the cliff towards something a little bit more deleterious. I think some of those people would be really well served by reading your book. I'm not holding my breath by any means. I hope you do get onto the New York Times bestseller list one day. And it seems like this is going to be a long, drawn-out fight. But, I'm happy that we have people like you fighting that fight and making the most empirically watertight and clearly articulated case possible. So thanks so much for joining me. Just huge appreciation and gratitude for the work that you do. Again, I'm just such a huge fan of the book. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time. And again, just thank you for giving me so much of your time today. I really, truly appreciate it.
Well, you're welcome, and thanks for having me as a guest. It's been a good chat, and you highlight some of the chapters that other people who've interviewed me have skipped over, and so you kept the conversation interesting and lively for me. And I do encourage everyone to go read the book. You'll probably learn something, at least one of the 35 chapters, right? If I have 35 chances, hopefully I hit a bullseye and taught you something, at least one of them. But thanks for having me.
Well, if it doesn't have that effect on some person, maybe it's something to do with their IQ.
Yeah, or they already knew more about the field than I did. So
there you go, or the other side of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much again, Russell. It's been a real pleasure.
Bye.
All right. Cheers. Bye-bye. And they got me thinking.